The Canterbury Earthquake damage was just huge. I've never seen anything like it in my life.
At the start, the scale was enormous.
The impact was massive. You could see that it's going to have dramatic effect on the local community, and certainly our people were there straight away.
The team that quickly developed at Nectar put together some clear priorities about what came first and what we wanted to focus on.
Nectar has over 26 professional services organisations involved in it, and Tonkin and Taylor's right out there with one of the key suppliers of engineering and environmental expertise.
But for us, we see all these things actually as an opportunity for us to actually help and really kickstart these things quickly from experience we've had here in Christchurch particularly.
Well, the expertise that TNT has been critical to just ensuring that we get fast information around geotech, the environmental aspects and looking after that side of things, and the whole raft of things that TNT provides.
Oh, the culture at Nectar is fantastic. It's everyone is trying to move mountains, really.
Why has the project been successful? Part of, I think, the success of the team is the fact that we haven't rested on our laurels. When we got sections of the corridor and individual assets open, that was a success and a milestone in itself, but we quickly moved forward to looking at what was the next challenge that we needed to address. Let's get the full length of the line open. As soon as that was knocked off, we're now on to road opening, and everyone's focused, and I think that's been the success of the programme for me. Everyone's continued ability to pick themselves up from one milestone and then strive for that next challenge.
Yeah, and I mean, look, these cars are moving today, so we've got the road open, and that's great. We've moved thousands of cubic metres of soil to keep it open, and we'll have to move a couple of thousand more, and we'll keep it open. And we're building in resilience as we go, and making sure that they'll never get isolated again. Thanks.
Being out there and going to the supermarket or going to a community meeting or having dinner in a restaurant and running into locals and having them walk up to you and thank you, it's pretty rewarding.
Oh, look, I'm very proud to represent Tonkin Taylor with the Nectar, a bunch of companies, and we're all working, one goal, one idea.
Here at the Kaikoura railway station, there's a plaque on the wall. There's a commemoration for the people who lost their lives in building this the first time around. And there's a massive sense of pride, but also responsibility that comes with trying to rebuild the network that they put in place in the start.
It's an inspiring team that just gives mountains of energy to the work at hand. I think that's who they are, and that's the type of people we employ at TNT.
Kia ora, ka mihi a hau I te tuatahi ki te haukainga, ngā iwi toko toru. Nā koutou e mau ana te ahika o tēnei whenua, tēnā koutou katoa. I ngā mana, I ngā reo, rauranga tira mā e hui mai nei runga I tēnei kaupapa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. To the organising committee, thank you so much for having Dr. Leigh and I here today. I'm a bit horrified that you saw me cry already on the video, but as you can tell, it's been a pretty emotional experience for us to date. So to start, even though it's first thing in the morning, I'd just like us to take a moment. I'd like us to spend some time reflecting on where we are at right now. To sit still in this moment. To listen to people who might be shuffling next to us. To acknowledge how we're feeling. Maybe we feel tired. Maybe some of us feel hungover. Or maybe you're excited about what you're about to hear over the course of this conference. You might be nervous about the presentations that you've got to give over the next couple of days. I want you to notice the sounds around you. I want you to think about the things that you take for granted. Like getting up in the morning, that the lights will go on when you flick the switch, that the hot water will come out of the tap when you turn it on, that your car will start, and that there'll be a road for you to drive on. And maybe there'll be a train arriving at the train station to take you to work. All of these things give us a sense of security because they're permanent and they'll always be there. But in some cases, they're not. And that feeling that comes with realizing how it feels when things that you take for granted are taken away from you was my very first feeling when I saw the devastation from the Kaikoura earthquake. So the concept of land being permanent is embodied in Māori proverbs. And Hugh's just given you one version of it, and I'll give you a slightly different one. Toi tū te whenua, toi ora te wai whatu ngaro te tangata. Let the permanence of the land remain intact, let the water abound. However, people come and go. So when the earth moves, this can be a traumatic experience. It creates emotional trauma that can shatter your sense of security, making you feel helpless. When land that you know looks like this suddenly looks like this. You can feel overwhelmed, isolated, and frightened, and it's your subjective emotional experience of the event. So for many small communities that line the Kaikoura coast, this natural hazard of living alongside and on fault lines suddenly became a natural disaster impacting their day-to-day lives. And that's an example of the coastal uplift in South Bay that some of you might have seen. So with all this trauma and the hypersensitivity that locals face with new stresses, managing our stakeholders and communities in a way that meets their appetite for information, their expectation, and helps to alleviate their concerns has been one of our biggest challenges that we'll describe to you today. And this is the context in which Leigh and I work. This earthquake, which frames our discussion today, and a lot of the presentations I see over the next couple of days, although a disaster, has created an enormous opportunity for understanding our environment and the coastal processes deeply. Leigh and I suggest that we should consider the impacts of the earthquakes, not just in terms of the ecosystems, but also in terms of the livelihoods, goods and services that these ecosystems provide, and the people that rely on them and can't imagine living without them. So we'll give you some examples of sustainable livelihoods and how they depend on the environment in which they're situated. We'll talk about taking the opportunity to do things better to improve the capacity and the ecosystem so that we're creating more resilient communities to future disasters. So Hugh indeed highlighted that yesterday was 1 year on since the earthquake, and yesterday I was honoured to be at the Dawn Blessing in Kaikoura, which did mean that I traversed 4 cities in one day to be here. But we celebrated the opening of the Kaikoura Marina and commemorated 1 year on of the earthquake, which we had two people who lost their lives. But the establishment and the reopening of the Kaikoura Marina meant that we were recreating and enabling the economic mainstay, which is the whale watch and dolphin encounter facilities that marina provides. So Leigh and I have achieved and learnt a lot, I think, over the last 12 months. So it's this journey that we want to take you on today. And we want to share with you 3 things in 3 parts. So firstly, we want to give you a sense of scale. So I know a lot of you in this room have appreciation of the earthquake and its effects, but we're just going to recap on that briefly. And we're going to talk about the challenges that this created. We want to give you a sense of the response and recovery. So how we created a plan for flexibility to adapt and the opportunities that were created from that. And lastly, we want to describe this tension that we face every day in our job, which is between rebuilding quickly and rebuilding deliberately, and provide you with some clear, concrete outcomes that we've had to date. So Leigh and I are going to tag team seamlessly, throughout this presentation to traverse the journey above, so bear with us.
Thanks, Manea. So this time last year, I was in Wellington, waiting for my office to be deemed safe to re-enter. At the time, I thought, well, this is the end of my earthquake experience. But oh, how really wrong I was. I never thought that 1 year on, I'd be presenting at a conference on matters pertaining to earthquake recovery. I remember the morning after the earthquake, taking a walk around the city and seeing the inter-island of ferries anchored out in the middle of the harbour. I thought, wow, this is a serious one. Now, I know that a number of people in this room probably know or can explain better what actually happened during that event, but I'm just going to recap just to give you a brief summary. So there was a complex series of ruptures, approximately 21, that had a cumulative magnitude of 7.8. The force of those ruptures was enough to move the South Island closer to the North Island by approximately 6 metres, and it caused vertical coastal uplift of a matter of several metres as well. This was a major event, and I was tasked with leading the ecology for the rebuild. We've put this slide in here just to give you a bit of a context of the geographic extent over which the earthquake damage occurred. So on the rail network, there were some 761 damaged sites on the main North Rail line. And this spanned over 200 kilometres, from Phoebe in the south to Tuamarina in the north. There was damage to the rail tracks, which is a bit of an understatement, to the slopes, to embankments, culverts, tunnels, bridges and communications. And that's rail alone. For the road, there were over 200 damaged sites along State Highway 1. North of Kaikoura, there were 9 major slips and just as many secondary slips. To the south, there were some 32 slips. There was damage to roads, structures and retaining walls. On State Highway 70, the inland road, there were at least 40 damaged sites. Damage caused by the earthquake to both the inland and the coastal highways meant that Kaikoura was essentially cut off and required evacuation of people by air and sea. I now want to set the scene in terms of the values that were present along the Kaikoura coast prior to the earthquake. I'm going to start with ecology because that's really where I feel most comfortable and think it's more exciting. And while over the course of the year, there's been a lot of media coverage around seals and what we've been doing around seals. Some of you may have seen Manea on the news on Monday. Seals aren't pets. There's a tag quote from Manea for that one. But I just want to give a little shout out to the threatened gravel maggot that we have there as well. No kidding, there is actually a gravel maggot that's threatened that occurs along the Kaikoura coast. But now maybe moving to something that people are a bit more familiar or interested in terms of ecology. Kaikoura is well known nationally and internationally for its natural environment. The term mountain to sea is often used to describe the fact that there are uninterrupted ecosystems running all the way from the alpine zone down to the ocean. Oho Point Fur Seal Sanctuary is the largest fur seal breeding colony on the east coast of the South Island. This was home to some 4,000 seals prior to the earthquake. Awesome. Hutton shearwater, an at-risk species. It's found in 2 colonies in the world. They're both located in the seaward Kaikoura Ranges. While the expansive vegetation coastal slips are iconic to the Kaikoura coastline, they also hold a number of vegetative values. These terrestrial ecosystems are important due to the sequences, diversity and level of endemism and distributional limits of some of the species that are found there. One such example is that of the Oho rock daisy, which is found only on those bluffs. The waterways which flow from the mountain to the sea have high freshwater values. There's at least 20 native species recorded in the waterways around Kaikoura. Most of those are threatened or at-risk species. Lizards. There's some 12 species of threatened or at-risk species of lizard on the Kaikoura district alone. And these are just a handful of the many ecological values that are present. Immediately following the earthquake, the fate of these values was unknown. But on first glance, it was obvious that our starting point wasn't a business as usual, no effect scenario. There were major slips and coastal uplifts. One of the major slips occurred at Oha Seal Sanctuary, right over the breeding grounds, right at the time when females were coming back to the colony to start pupping. It's pretty awesome to say that 1 year on, we've come full circle, and last weekend we had our first pup born for the season. For Hutton's Shearwater, approximately 15% of the population was buried due to under the slips, and for the rock daisy, well, 95% of that population was lost, again due to the slips. In the waterways, there's been huge amounts of sedimentation into some of those streams purely due to the landslides that have happened right up the catchments. And there's been rockfalls that have blocked some of the streams. These obviously creating barriers for fish. Well, for lizards, because there was very little known about the distribution of these species and the population numbers prior to the earthquake, we actually have no pre-earthquake baseline data to compare what the values there are now to. But the values of the Kaikoura coast go well beyond that of ecology. The area is home to a thriving community and known at a global level as a tourism destination for its iconic scenery, coastal and oceanic attractions such as dolphin and whale and pelagic seabird encounters. The coastal environment also provides for customary recreational and commercial fisheries. The Kaikoura Marina was one of the largest sources of income for the region, and at the Dawn Blessing yesterday, 12 months on, as Manea said, we reopened that facility back up for the community. The natural environment provides sustainable livelihoods for the Kaikoura coastal communities. Well, what happened to those values? Well, I remember on my first visit down to Kaikoura post-earthquake, just how hard it was to get my head around seeing rocks stranded well above mean high water spring, with bull kelp some 2 metres high hanging off them, high and dry. Seeing what once was intertidal pools, now completely above mean high water spring and just full of stagnant water. The smell of death and decay was pretty overwhelming, and the impact on the coastal and marine environment was evident. I now want to take you through a quick snapshot of the magnitude of the infrastructural damage that occurred by running through some numbers. Landslides. There were some 85 of those that occurred during the earthquake, 12 of which were major. For the rail, it wasn't just the 200 kilometres of rail that was affected. Some 50 bridges needed repair, and 3 needed to be completely replaced. 20 rail tunnels were damaged. Again, on my first visit in December last year, I remember being absolutely amazed at seeing just tracks that were just tossed off into the coastal environment. 302 retaining walls were damaged. 97 of these were along the coast. And as a result, seawalls are being built now at various locations along the coast. And these range from 5 to 10 metres high. Some 7,000 seawall blocks are required in the section north of Kaikoura alone. Each of those blocks weighs 5 tonnes. These blocks have to be transported to site by truck. Each truck takes 5 blocks at a time. That's a whole lot of truck movements, especially when the South Coastal Road isn't open. While a year on we can rattle off some of these awesome facts and figures to you, it's important to note that there were a lot of unknowns at the onset of this project. For instance, we didn't know how much material we were going to have to move. We didn't know how we were going to move it, and we really didn't know where we were going to move it to. When you consider the values that we were working with, the scale of damage, and the location and geographic extent of this, it was apparent that there was going to be a need to create a plan with flexibility to adapt.
I'm also going to add some figures because our comms team love them. But apparently we've moved so much dirt to date from the landslides that it's enough to fill Wellington Stadium, for those of you who've been there. And equally, so Oho Point, one of our biggest slips, you would have seen in Leigh's slide, 150,000 cubes of material sitting in that. I think, and maybe someone in this room can correct me, that the Manawatu Gorge, one of those slips was 3,500, to put it in perspective. And we had 8 Oho Points. So, look, a wiser American president than the one that they currently have now once said, in preparing for battle, I've always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. That was Eisenhower. I'm sure back here at home we probably had eloquent speakers, but we didn't document them. We were just expert orators. So this time last year, it truly felt like we were about to head into battle. And again, from Leigh's summary, you can see why. After a natural disaster, what's been demonstrated nationally and internationally is that local governments face an enormous amount of pressure to rebuild quickly, to get things back to normal, whatever normal is, as fast as possible. This can be thought of as the first plan, because it's the plan that many people have in their minds, and it's the recovery vision. Effectively getting people and communities back to the status quo. Except what communities tend to struggle with is that there is no what was there before baseline. This isn't a no effects starting point, because things have changed. The first plan may not make the most of opportunities for improving infrastructure in communities, and stakeholders have a hard time contemplating changes to their local area. So our government at the time, 1 year ago, a different government, evaluated the recovery from that first plan standpoint. And it then made 3 very brave calls in regards to the road and rail specifically, which were, they committed the funds immediately. So they did some quick optioneering and assessments to say, yes, we will rebuild that road and we will rebuild that rail where it is, due to its significance to the community and those sustainable livelihoods that we're talking about and the New Zealand economy. And that in order to do that work, we'll commit to establishing an alliance. And I'll talk about that soon, because that really did action things really fast. And thirdly, they said, yep, we're going to create enabling legislation based on our experience with Canterbury, and we're going to progress that with urgency. So the first plan morphed into Plan 2, which built in recovery works in a manner that enabled improvement in what's already there, and we'll give you some examples soon. So talking about legislation is never sexy, and as a planner by trade, I'm always the one left to do it. But there's no doubt in my mind that what's been achieved to date has only been enabled through that robust legislative framework that is the emergency legislation. So first we had the Hiranui Kaikoura Recovery Act, and it had a broad purpose with the principal intention of helping earthquake-affected communities and their councils to respond to and recover from the impacts of the earthquake. Now, much like Canterbury, Section 8 of that Act enabled orders in council, and orders in council were allowed certain ministers to address specific matters such as key infrastructure. From an environmental and coastal perspective, it's really important to note that in this high-level legislation, it was recognised that there needed to be requirements for environmental effects to be considered, controlled and mitigated where necessary, and that helped to set the flow-on environmental framework that came out of that. That is a picture looking south towards Oho. No, that's Slip 9, so that's just to the north of Oho Point. So the development of the order in council to address the road and rebuild was progressed with urgency, and it amended over 12 pieces of legislation, which I don't expect you to read up there, but they directly relate to the coastal corridor. And they created expedited processes for environmental approvals. Now, this is normally the point where I hear sharp intakes of breath from people who work in council or local government, or I see disappointed looks on the faces of people who perceive this as a means to enable those doing the work to do whatever they want. And in the prescriptive environment that we work in, I think I can understand this perspective. It's a trust us model that requires you know, one of the biggest challenges for technical experts working with traumatised, sceptical and overloaded stakeholders is to say that we'll do things right and we'll do things properly. So because of these broad intrinsic environmental values that Leigh's described to you, recognition of the challenges that could be presented in rebuilding in such a sensitive environment was made at a government level very quickly. So they built the environmental framework from the Act into the Order in Council with flexibility to respond to changes and to adapt where we need to. Now let me give you some brief examples of why we desperately needed the ability and flexibility to adapt during this process. Over the past 12 months, we've had 2 cyclones, 2 tropical depressions, which I've learned weren't quite cyclones, and one in 15-year rainfall event only a couple of weeks ago, which means that our hillsides just keep giving. So as a consequence, the quantum of landslide material that we thought we had back in January has more than doubled. So that means we've got more material and we've got to look for more places to put it. The Earth also keeps moving, so we still have earthquake sequences rolling through Kaikoura and the surrounding area. And some of our biggest challenges is that we've got these sites along the coastal corridor that have been unsafe for us or our NECTA team to get in and actually do the groundwork to establish what the ground conditions are like. So that's meant that we're only just understanding some geotechnical considerations and some of our most trickiest sites to inform what type of bridge foundations or structure foundations we need at that location. So for us, change is the law of life, and when you're working with these coastal communities, you learn that change is their only constant. I really like this slide. So this is something that Al Nisbet, who works for the press, put together really early on in the emergency process. And for me, it kind of talks to the fact that emergency legislation has indeed paved the way for robust processes to happen at pace without perceived bureaucracy, even though it teeters at the top of the cliff there waiting to fall down at any moment. So because legislation is so riveting, I'm just going to give you 60 seconds to turn to your neighbour, preferably the neighbour you haven't met yet, and briefly introduce yourself, and then just give them the first word that comes to mind when you think about earthquake recovery. 60 seconds. Go for it. All right, let's come back together. I just realised that 60 seconds is actually quite a long time, so I'm not going to give you that. I'll just give you 30 instead. And I'm sure I heard the first words that came to mind when you're talking about earthquake recovery. Does anyone feel like shouting out or whispering what some of those words were? Communities. Nice. John. Faith. Nice. Yeah, faith or trust. Key theme of what we do. Anything else?
Preparation.
What's that? Erosion?
Preparation.
Preparation. Yeah, I was like, erosion, very specific. Yeah, preparation, absolutely. So I'm surprised no one said exhaustion. Leigh and I could probably talk to that right now because it just never stops. So running in parallel to the legislation was NZTA's commitment to establish a recovery organisation. For any natural disasters, recovery requires response, and response typically means fast, very fast mobilisation of resources. So by that I mean mobilisation of people, but also mobilisation of plant and getting it there. So before Christmas, some of you might have seen on the news, we had over 300 people on site moving mountains to get the inland road open so that we could restore that access ASAP, and they did that amazingly only a couple of days after the earthquake, as well as reopening the road to the south on a periodic timetable, which is what we're currently operating under. That was the immediate response, but for the long-term recovery response, the New Zealand Transport Agency and Kiwi Rail spearheaded the formation of these two organisations' first ever joint alliance partnership. So Kiwi Rail and NZTA had never come together like this before. And what they did is they pulled in the 4 lead contractors, so Fulton Hogan, Hebb, Downer and Higgins, who you will be familiar with, and over, I see I've got 27 there, I think I said 26 on the video, and I've got 28 here. So roughly 26 to 28 professional services organisations to form an organisation of currently 1,600 staff is what we have in the Nectar organisation. I'm the head of the environmental team, and Leigh is our project ecologist, and she has an ecology team and the environmental team. And we have around 45 people as part of that 1,600. The large majority of those people are people on the ground moving mountains. If you were to Google Nectar in January, you would come up, true story, with the National Counter-Terrorism Intelligence requirements for the Canadian government. So that's what happens when you let two commercial people choose the name of your organisation. Many of you will be really familiar with the alliance model. So the intent of an alliance is to create a collaborative organisation where the client, and in this instance our clients, NZTA and KiwiRail, are part of that collaboration, and the pain and gain and the successes and failures are shared. So it creates this environment where no matter who you work for, and no matter who your home organisation is, as we like to call it, you're one team with one set of values. So demonstrated opportunities and innovation that arise from alliances have been demonstrated in Waterview, Mackay's to Peka Peka, Memorial Park Alliance, and they're all around the flexibility to innovate and adapt because your resources are at hand and you can call on them to respond immediately. So of course alliances have their downsides. There's always commercial tensions around going into business with your competitors, but the speed in which NZTA and KiwiRail established the Nectar Alliance meant that it cut through these typical commercial realities, forced quick decision making that's really required in a recovery context, and meant that we could mobilise the troops and head into battle. So just very quickly, the emergency legislation, so we had the Act, then we have the Order in Council that enabled us to head into environmental approvals pretty quickly, and Nectar was tasked with pulling those together on behalf of the agencies. Internationally, the devastation in Kobe in 1995 and California in 1989 flagged that there was limited to no post-earthquake recovery framework and legislation. So, and particularly around the environment, and that was really interesting because Kobe happened in a really significant environmental area and had a lot of devastation on the environmental values there. And so I challenge that equally New Zealand, you know, we have a long way to go in terms of post-event planning regimes. I think it's great that we're focusing on pre-planning around natural hazards, but we equally need to have a way to mobilise fast in post-earthquake scenarios, and I think we've got a lot of work to do there. So over the geographical extent, let me take you through our exciting approvals process. First, we focused on our key areas. So Site 2, which was Iron Gate, which was a picture Leigh showed you earlier, and then Orho Point, our big baby slip, and the one to the north of Orho Point. So we just sought broad approvals for those packages of work. Then we took a broader approach and we consented footprints from Kaikoura North and Kaikoura South, and what we were really doing is matching the pace of our design team, who was struggling to pull in data, come up with concept designs and get them through to consenting. Then we had all of our Department of Conservation approvals, so we've got a huge amount of legislation we're working under. We've got marine mammals permits, wildlife permits, works and dock reserves, and so on and so on. So we took a broad approach to those. Then we have the largest archaeological footprint that's ever been applied on an infrastructural project in New Zealand. And that's because, well, partly because this is Ngaitahu's largest migration area. And I like Ngaitahu says, you know, we had 4,000 people in the area and they're still there somewhere. And with all this movement of hillsides and the coast, we're uncovering them. And then we had another consents package. It's just important to flag that because those of you who are involved in consenting know that it never ends. And then we also had, so inland route, Leigh highlighted that there were 40 damage areas on the inland route, so we had a whole bunch of approvals to do for that. And just as an interesting side note, when we're thinking about all our work on the coast, we realised that we didn't actually have enough accommodation to house everyone. So we had 300 people we needed to put into Kaikoura. You can imagine how the community initially felt about that. And so we established the Nectar Kaikoura Village, which houses 300 of our team. A community inside a community is like how we like to describe it. And then we also had to do one at Clarence because our transport was blocked between Kaikoura and Clarence, so we needed to put people in the north as well. And then finally, something we haven't progressed just yet, but you have all of the tidy up work coming in around changing property boundaries and designations of the transport corridor when we're finished at some stage. So of course the challenge of all of this was to create a roadmap of approvals for ourselves based on very limited and continuously changing environmental information right from the mountains to the sea. So added to the complexity was that these consents were non-notified, controlled activities, so it meant that they passed without community consultation, but the community was in need of some certainty around design and what they could expect in the future. And they were used to business as usual processes. So their expectations, we couldn't meet them initially because we just didn't have the data so early on. So fundamentally, in terms of building in a community process, and also in recognition of some lessons learnt by the government from the Canterbury Earthquake, the legislation required the formation of this group called the Restoration Liaison Group. And the parties who were party to that group were defined in the legislation. So things needed to happen fast. We needed to give certainty to the community, so we established this group as our vehicle for those parties to have input. So the RLG is made up of the 4 councils, Environment Canterbury, Kaikoura, Marlborough and Hurunui. And then Ngaitahu, so Te Runanga or Ngaitahu, as well as Te Runanga or Kaikoura, based in Kaikoura. And I don't know if some of you saw the news last night, but there was a whole lot of appreciation given to Te Runanga or Kaikoura because of their first responder as part of the earthquake. And some of you might remember the stories of the crayfish and the marae supplying all of the food to keep all the tourists going before they got evacuated. And just recently we had Boris Johnson out saying his personal thanks to that marae. Department of Conservation, who are a key partner for us in the environmental space, Heritage New Zealand, the Marine Guardians, which is interesting because that's a community group, and you'll notice that the rest are regulators. And don't think I've forgotten anyone there. Now the Restoration Liaison Groups, they had one broad function, which was to inform the design, management and monitoring of all the works. But that was it. There was no detail, there was no prescription in the condition of consent in the order in council that said what that actually meant. So the parties needed to come together and write a terms of reference, and the terms of reference I thought was going to be a document that we shelved and never went back to, but that terms of reference set out very clearly how we were going to hold each other accountable, how we were going to continuously have challenging conversations, and what our expectations of each other were. And whilst that doesn't sound like rocket science, sometimes in community consultative forums, I don't think we invest the time in establishing those protocols right at the beginning, collectively, so that we're all on the same page when we move forward. We initially met fortnightly, and the key people I didn't put in this was NZTA and Kiwirau, who are fundamentally part of the Restoration Liaison Group. And then we're now meeting monthly because we've moved past a large quantum of the information. So we rely heavily on information sharing from all sides, and it's a forum to raise matters and challenge each other. I firmly believe that this is going to be one of the best success stories coming out of the earthquake. It's a real testimony to how, when the why or the purpose, the noble purpose in this case is clear, you can move forward at speed. So just quickly, the environmental framework had a whole lot of other prescriptive conditions set in the order in council, and those are up there. And now I'll hand over to Leigh to talk about how some of these were implemented.
Thank you. So as you can see, one of the conditions up there was the requirement to develop a set of ecological principles. And those ecological principles that we had to set up at the start were to guide the design and construction of the coastal rebuild. And so we came up with 10 very simple principles shown on the slide, and they are simply relate to about how to avoid and minimise effects on the ecological values that were present post-earthquake. These principles aren't prescriptive like consent conditions, but they've been part of the environmental framework that has enabled us to work collaboratively with other organisations and internally to achieve environmental outcomes. So one example of how this has been implemented is our work with DOC to save the Oha rock daisy. As mentioned earlier, some 95% of that population was lost under one of the major slips. We worked with DOC to devise a protocol for collecting the seed off the bluff, and we had the resources there to implement that on site. We got our fabulous abseilers, who were at the time scaling the bluffs, to collect some of those seed heads of the remaining daisies. Those seed heads were then taken and stored in a muesli box into the fridge of the smoker room in Kaikoura, where I then picked them up, transferred them to one of our seal handlers, who then put them in his bag, took them up to Nelson and gave them to DOC. So from those seed heads of 6 plants, DOC have been able to propagate some 200 seedlings. And what's neat about this outcome is that these actions have secured the long-term survival of that daisy, not just through the plants that were propagated, but also by securing a seed source. And that safeguards us against future events. That's something we didn't have prior to the earthquake. As Manea mentioned before, it's an environment that's changing, and we've had to respond to that changing environment, and the framework's allowed us to do that. As an example, it's about how we treat and stabilise our slopes. One of the most obvious impacts from the earthquake are the coastal slips. In the short term, it's impossible to recreate what was there before. And due to the location and size of the slips, the primary focus has had to be on stabilising these slopes. And we're working with the geotechnical engineers in that space, and we're trialling different methods of hydro-seeding mixes. And we aren't aware of any other projects that have used helicopters to hydro-seed in New Zealand. The flexibility around our framework has enabled innovation. And management of seals is another area that we've needed a lot of flexibility, and that's been critical to our ability to minimise the effects and achieve better environmental outcomes. For instance, we've had to be innovative with how we manage seals in areas where it isn't safe to send our seal handlers in. Normally, DOC impose an exclusion distance over which helicopters are allowed to fly in order to avoid disturbance to marine mammals. We've flipped that on its head, and we've used those techniques to herd seals away from slips when these areas are being worked. Again, this technique of heli-herding is successful in minimising effects on seals, and it's a world first. The loss of the seal breeding grounds has meant that we've had to influence the various designs on the project. Prior to the earthquake, approximately 2,000 seal pups were born at Oha Point at this time every year. As mentioned earlier, much of that habitat was lost, and as such, the female seals are now having to redistribute up the coastline and find different areas to pup. And we've been working closely with DOC to gain an understanding of where those new pupping areas might be, so that we can work that into the design of the road in terms of barriers for making sure that they can't access areas such as road and rail. Similarly, the lookout point and stream, for which is very famous for people to go and see the seals frolicking up in the rock pool, these have both been lost in the earthquake, and we've taken this opportunity to incorporate an improved seal viewing area into the design, again taking into account the likely redistribution of the seal colony along the coast. Manea and I were reflecting on these examples in our preparation for today, and we were really heartened by the fact that none of these innovations were driven by prescriptive conditions, but by the framework that was flexible in the way we could achieve these outcomes. And it's because of that non-prescriptive nature of the framework in which we're operating. It's allowed us to trial new methods with flexibility and adapt as we go. But in doing so, there's always been a tension between rebuilding quickly and rebuilding deliberately.
But before I start, that's a picture of something we've done just recently. So we used helicopters initially to sluice a lot of the slips to get the material down so then we could start clearing it. And we focused a lot on slips, but they were some of our most challenging activities that we needed to do. This was a different technique where we had a rock on a slope that we just wouldn't come down from above. So the guys got really excited about trialling this high pressure hose to angle it slightly. So we had a period of closure on this. This is down south of Kaikoura, and they worked non-stop to do that. I know that the expertise in this room is probably thinking, wow, where did that all go in terms of the sediment? And it's a bit of a bummer that out of this picture you can't see what our environmental team did, which was our robust sediment control that we spent frantic days getting in place so that the guys could do this. So yeah, there is a tension that exists between rebuilding quickly and rebuilding deliberately. So in the processes associated with normal city building, there's always, it's similar. So there's a tension between doing things quickly and making well thought out decision making. But in the post-disaster period, the tension increases because the timeline compresses, speed becomes a central measure of recovery, and this has certainly been our case. However, local governments must rebuild well, not just quickly, and we have to ensure that any structure repairs are done correctly. We need to consider changes to codes and new information that comes to light as we start to understand the event itself, or how we can make the community better in other ways. So because the government has such clear objectives from the outset of this project, pace was critical to achieve our stretch targets of rail opening early and road opening by Christmas. So what did this mean in reality? I guess instead of consenting, designing, constructing and monitoring, which is a nice linear process, we've done all of those things in parallel. So it really relies on an immense amount of collaboration and active dot connecting between various disciplines and different departments in the entire organisation. So in terms of rebuilding better, and we're heading towards the end of our presentation now, but just a couple of slides at the end to show you before, during and afters. We don't quite have afters just yet. But at Mangamonu Bay, which is just north of Kaikoura, some of you might remember, it's the bit of the coast, you wouldn't have driven it for a while, but it's where you hit the coast again after you've gone out of Kaikoura Township. There's a cycleway proposed to start at that point and head north, and so that's part of the improvements package and the recovery efforts of NZTA and KiwiRail to improve the general amenity of the area and not just rebuild what's already there. The pictures there show some of our big slips, and then the works on the coastal foreshore where we have pushed out into not quite the CMA because we're not below mean high water, but we're certainly going out away from some of those challenging slopes to add some more resilience into the network. This is Iron Gate Bridge, so it's a whole lot of work going on there at the moment. My slides really want to jump. And Iron Gate, again, there was a need to create resilience. So you can see the old road in the back of the picture on your left, where we're avoiding that and coming out into the foreshore. So that's where some of the seawalls that Leigh described are being created. And again, that was around providing some tourism opportunities. There'll be some amenity areas in that general location and showcasing environmental values at that location. So we have got fast, robust decision making, but the key concept in that statement is that it needs to be fast.
Just a few, I suppose, wrap-up comments for us. In terms of conclusions, one of the main points is never underestimate the challenges that may face you ahead. You don't know what you don't know. And that's where we started. It's an uncomfortable but necessary position to have flexibility. It's uncomfortable for those working on the project, and it's also uncomfortable for the community. But it's essential to get better environmental outcomes under recovery responses. Speed and pace. Collaboration is essential for good environmental outcomes.
Look, I just wanted to finish with a story, and I wanted to share a story about one of my colleagues who's, I don't think here, but some of you might know, Richard, Ryan and Hamill. So one of our small coastal communities along our footprint, they work and live day to day with the emotional trauma of the earthquake. So their livelihoods depend on the coast, walking, fishing, the surfing, and its natural experience. And after the shock of the event itself, they were faced with trucks driving 24/7 past their house 7 days a week. They're directly under our helicopter flight path, and at its peak I think we had about 14 helicopters going, sluicing. And they live with the uncertainty of what their coastlines will look like in the future. And they were living in a knowledge vacuum. So this challenge that exists when everything moves fast around you. And their thirst for understanding was not only about the infrastructure recovery works, but also around the coastal processes of the coast. So I definitely fronted many of these meetings. We're meeting them regularly to update them on the road and rail progress. But one day we thought we'd take the opportunity to take Richard along to describe his understanding of the post-quake coastal processes based on other similar events. So they listened to the story of their coast based on the history of other similar coasts around the country, and they listened to technical information delivered in a way that they could relate to and they could understand. So I watched this community group collectively sigh as he moved through his presentation. I saw a small weight lift off their shoulders, because this information, even though as technical experts sometimes we don't realise it, provided some way to understand this event, to know that even though it's unique, it's happened elsewhere, and so we can draw on that to learn, and that there's data and information coming up to move forward. So Leigh and I's challenge to you all, as you listen to the awesome lineup of presentations over the next couple of days, is to ask yourself, how will you share your technical expertise and experiences, not just within your profession and industry, but with our wider communities? How are you going to turn your science into stories? Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā te koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.